Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight's Hypothetical is the second in the annual Hypothetical series conducted by People and Culture Strategies. With us in the room tonight, we have representatives from some of Australia's biggest companies, which means many of you will be PC+S clients, but of course to everyone here in the room tonight, a very warm welcome to you all. It's a great honour for me to be involved, even in a very small way this evening, and also for us to bring along the camera and record this in order to broadcast it on Australia's Public Affairs channel probably early next week, and that's Sky News National's APAC channel. So it is great for us to be involved tonight. I think there's a big topic underway here for this Hypothetical tonight. It's obvious that in business, people matter. You all know that. You work with it all the time. But of course, the best companies, you know, they're really treating employees and people as the valuable assets that they are. That doesn't mean that managing the workplace and managing people is easy. It's certainly not, and you know that as good as anyone. And of course, this year in 2013, we've seen some huge regulatory change in the workplace relations landscape. It's all ramping up again, of course, on the 1st of January, as many of you will be aware, with the introduction of new bullying laws, which will come into place as part of the Fair Work legislation. In the business media, I've got to say, I think we've been covering workplace issues far more extensively in the last couple of years, between landmark reform and the restructuring which has happened post-GFC, and of course also a couple of juicy high-profile scandals that the media loves. Well, we have never been short of something topical to talk about when it comes to workplace relations. That means it's no accident that the PC+S founder, Joydeep Hor, has become a very well-known face on Sky News Business. He's kind of become our go-to commentator for anything on workplace relations. If you know Joydeep, or indeed if you've seen him on some of our segments on Sky News or in other media, you'll know he has quite a unique approach to legal problem solving, and there's always a focus there on education. And I know that tonight it will be no different. Tonight's Hypothetical is going to be looking at one of the most challenging workplace issues, and that is the issue of termination of employment. Now, it's never easy, and that's never going to be a painless process, but of course carefully managing it can reduce the fallout. PC+S has produced a video especially for tonight's event, and it's depicting a termination scenario. So we'll be watching that video, all of us, tonight. After the video plays, we'll have a lively panel discussion. Everyone's already ready to go, and I expect it to be in true Geoffrey Robertson style. The panel represents quite a wide cross-section of expertise, areas that touch on or really are relevant in understanding the issues at hand. Michele Grow, who's in the middle there at the moment, the CEO of Davidson Trahaire Corpsych, one of Australia's leading providers of employee assistance programs. She's on the panel tonight along with Hanna Low, who's up the end, legal affairs editor and journalist at the Australian Financial Review. Tim Donaghey, a barrister specialising in employment law matters and author of a text on termination of employment, here, just on my left. John Dakin, up the other end, director of leading career transition business, Directioneering. And also we have tonight next to me Robyn Sefiani, and she's the founder and CEO of Sefiani Communications Group. Now, I think these panellists are very brave tonight, actually, because they are watching this video for the very first time with all of us. So this whole thing tonight will be unfolding before our very eyes. The response is very much authentic, and the discussion will be completely spontaneous. So it's a really unique event, and I'm looking very much forward to it. Now, of course, facilitating this discussion tonight, we're going to have the Managing Principal of People and Culture Strategies, as seen on Sky News Business. My good friend also, Joydeep Hor. So we'll look forward to that. But for now, the video, it's called The Most Difficult Dismissal of All, so please enjoy.
He left me with no choice.
I felt like a criminal.
I had to look after the company.
It was a form of bullying.
It's not personal, it's business.
This is my life.
This was one of the most difficult decisions I have had to make. Now, I'll be the first to acknowledge that Gary has done some tremendous things for this business. But when the numbers don't stack up, heads have got to roll. Well, Gary was our CEO, and he needed to be held to account. Accountability, it's critical.
The history? Where do I start? Well, I first joined the business in the late 80s. Junior sales representative, 40 to 50 hours on the road each week. Oh, the culture was different back then. We used to actually have fun. Relationships meant something both in and out of the business. Oh, sure, I'd be doing long hours, but I used to love it. It's funny you talk about contracts, though. When I started, I was given a one-pager. And even then, I didn't read it. It wasn't long before I got my first manager gig, and then it just kicked on from there. Mid-level management, leadership team position, and then became CEO 3 years ago. They did give me a contract to sign when I was announced as CEO. More of a phone book than a contract, though. They pushed hard for me to sign it, but I refused. Not so much that I was making a stand, I just wanted to get on with the job. I wasn't expecting to be sacked a few years into the role.
We acknowledge that Gary had a meteoric rise through the ranks, and I was certainly supportive of him being promoted to the CEO role. There were some murmurings that he was quite the lad in his earlier roles, but that's not that unusual in our line of work. Contracts. We have a big HR department. I expect that contracts are taken care of. I don't know why we don't have a signed contract on file for Gary. Probably just slipped through.
Well, ever since the private equity guys came on board, I feel like I've been a marked man. Well, I have no problems with accountability, but daily worklist reporting? Come on. I'm not a 19-year-old in his first job. I'm running a $65 million business here with 400 employees around the country. And you should have heard some of the comments made at these board meetings. Seriously, if that wasn't bullying, I don't know what is. Ambushing me by tabling reports that had been prepared behind my back, and that whole thing about the investigation, well, that was just a joke. Who did I speak to about it? Well, it's a bit hard when you're the CEO. Buck stops with me and all that, doesn't it? No, hang on. I did speak to Jeannie about it. Jeannie's our Director of People and Brand and reports to me. Obviously, I wasn't going to put anything in writing, but I absolutely said I was being bullied.
Did I feel uncomfortable about how the board was treating Gary? Well, I understand it wasn't pleasant, but we're not playing tiddlywinks here. This is a $65 million business with 400 employees around the country. And more importantly, the shareholders have put a shitload of money into this business and quite frankly are entitled to see results. Well, with the investigation, we had no choice. We had some very serious allegations that had been made against Gary. And if I didn't investigate them, I would have been exposed. We were not going to sit back and let the media have a field day with an expose on our CEO inviting key customers out on his yacht to be served drinks by escorts while judging a nautical pole dancing competition.
I understand that when you apply the microscope to the yacht incident, it looks bad, but as I shared with the investigator, there's a couple of critical issues. One, the culture of this industry, while not great, it's rife with this stuff. Two, I didn't even organise the bloody event. It was our Director of Sales, and I had words with him about it on the yacht. It's a bit rich, coming from this board. The stories I've heard about the Christmas parties these guys have had, well, don't forget, these were our biggest customers on that boat. And the work I generated on that day alone made up for the last quarter's losses.
No, I don't accept that there was any mixed messaging. Were we applying the blowtorch to improve sales? Absolutely. Was that giving free rein to engage in debauchery? Come on. Look, in any case, that investigation was left on the basis that Gary's culpability was inconclusive. Well, that was not the only reason we let him go. This was a termination for performance reasons. But the truth be told, I thought it was good to have a couple of other different reasons which I could base the decision on. Now, this business has undergone significant transformation in recent years, and Gary has not kept up with that, when in fact, we needed him to drive it.
Performance. We regret to advise you that the board has decided to terminate your employment for reasons of persistent and serious underperformance and failure to discharge your duties in a diligent way. What is that anyway? And how is it that I can be bulleted without so much as a cursory warning letter? We've spent tens of thousands of dollars having our HR guys roll out supposed best practice in performance management, where it's been my performance management. In fact, I've been given a bonus every year that I have been employed here, and not once have I been rated as not meeting expectations. Look, I know when I've let people go, it has always been after a fair process was followed. You know, warnings, counselling, the usual.
Yes, we have policies. Are they best practice? Well, I certainly hope so. We've certainly spent enough on them to ensure that they are. But it's a bit silly to expect that I or anyone else on the board was going to mollycoddle Gary through a Mickey Mouse performance improvement plan. And the truth be told, the very fact of him raising this just confirms what the board has thought for quite some time. He just doesn't get it. And that nonsense about bonuses and performance appraisals, the past is the past, and we have moved on.
3 months' pay. 3 months' pay. I have a mortgage, 3 kids in private schools, and because of the way this investigation thing was handled, my reputation has been significantly damaged. Oh, there's no way that 3 months is going to cut it. You know what's really sad about this? They knew about the stress that I've been under. They knew that I've been seeing a psych for my depression. It was almost as though that knowledge was what tipped them over the edge.
We felt that an amicable parting of the ways was the way to go. Opportunity to resign, 3 months' pay, deed signed, and a 6-month non-compete. Mind you, if some of the other board members had had their way, they wouldn't have paid Gary a cent. The 6th-month non-compete is in his latest contract anyway, and from what our lawyers tell us, it's industry standard.
Non-compete. You've got to be kidding. Even when people have signed contracts, we haven't enforced those. This is just more victimisation.
We're comfortable with our actions.
They've given me no choice but to fight. Am I worried about my reputation? No more than they should be worried about theirs.
Some battles just have to be fought. It's about the principle.
I just had to check my text messages to see whether I've been nominated for an Oscar next year. A warm welcome to you and my thanks to Brooke Corte for taking on the role of MC tonight. It's a great privilege for our firm to have you all here. And I hope you enjoyed that video. And I should probably also add a very important disclaimer that any resemblance to any organisation present here today is completely unintentional. I'm sure you're all thinking that was all about us, wasn't it? But what it tells us is that there is some commonality of issues, and we've got this wonderful panel here today to explore not just the legal issues that are involved in the scenario that you saw, but a wide range of other issues as well, as you will shortly see. You've got to spare a thought for Michele Grow, because after all of this happened, in fact, only within a week or two of these events transpiring, Michele's good friend, Frank, the chairman of the company, invites Michele to join the board as a non-executive director. He's very qualified, done the AICD thing and everything, served as a CEO, well-versed, and in the back of Frank's mind is some of the noise that he's heard around bullying, around culture, and all of that makes Michele an excellent choice to take on this vacant non-executive director role. So Michele, Frank sits down with you about half an hour or so before your first board meeting, and he tells you pretty much what he said on the video there. You've also heard some things on the grapevine, not dissimilar to what Gary has shared. What are you thinking? What are you feeling? What's troubling you, if anything?
I think there's a couple of things troubling me, Joydeep. I think firstly, either as a member of the board or as a chairman of the board, your role is actually much more than that. You are a director of the company and the chairman of the company. So the actions and decisions, apart from, you know, being in line with the Corporations Act, etc., are all about the culture of the organisation and having real clarity around process and protocol. So I think the first thing I would want to understand is what was the purpose of the reason of the termination? Was it on performance, or was it on some other issues? Because the information from Frank seems to be somewhat clouded. When you look at all of the data on CEOs, in fact, there's some, from my personal perspective, quite alarming information about CEOs. The vast majority are terminated on the basis of poor financial results, and the average time that happens is around the 6th year of their tenure. And I'm a couple of weeks away from completing my 6th year of tenure as a CEO of the organisation, so I think I'm about this far clear of being outside that space. So I think the first thing I would really want to understand is what was the real reason, because the conversation seems to be pretty meshed. Was it around poor financial performance? And every CEO has full accountability, not only for the financial performance, but for the entire core operations of the business. So there is certainly some very clear accountability there, and that is very much a role of the chairman. I think the second is, was it Frank's decision, or was it the decision, and was it a unanimous decision of the board? And for how long had those discussions been underway, and how do they then align with the values of the organisation? Because there seems to be some conflict there around the reasons outside of the financial performance. So I think personally I would have some individual concerns that I would want answered firstly by the chairman, and then I would want to have validated by the balance of the board, both the executive directors and non-executive directors.
You talk about the issue of fuzziness around reasons, and Frank says to you, yes, look, these things, Michele, are always fuzzy, but in this particular case I actually felt that it was better that we had some fuzz. It was better that we had multiple reasons, and I thought the fact that there was this rich tapestry actually made this an easier decision to make. What do you say to that?
I think it's not an easier decision. I think it's not an easier decision for the board. It's not providing the clarity of, here is due process that we followed. As a board, you know, there are a number of things that you need to be looking at, what, you know, the care, the diligence, and the proper process. And so I would want to be very clear about what was the proper process. There's no fuzziness around that. For Gary, he needs to be very clear, the reason for your termination is X. It shouldn't have any fuzziness around it. And for all of the board, whether that was a unanimous or not decision, they need to be very clear about where they move forward, what are the clear accountabilities for the next CEO, and in fact the rest of the management team. Okay.
Clear-cut versus fuzzy. John Dakin, you see terminations of employment every day of the week. This is your bread and butter. Help me out with my intuitive or counterintuitive logic around the fuzziness versus one clear reason point.
Joydeep, I normally think you're right, but I think this time you're not. I think clarity is really very, very important. What Gary was going through is it's confusing, and what is his performance? So where has he gone wrong? Was he trained for the role? There'd be all this going on in his mind, and because of that he'd be very angry. And you don't make good decisions when you're angry. So I think to have clarity around one issue as the key one for the severance is the way to go.
Okay. Well, Frank has a particular concern around Gary's very public profile. He was in fact the spokesman for the organisation. He was regularly speaking to the likes of Hanna Low and working very closely with Robyn Sefiani and her consulting business. That, of course, one assumes, at least as far as Robyn's concerned, might be a thing of the past for a little while. Hanna might be quite interested in having a conversation with Gary, but we'll come back to that in a moment. Frank is very concerned about what this loose cannon might do. He reaches out to you, Robyn. What do you tell him?
Well, I tell him that he's probably got a reputation issue, that there are concerns about Gary's behaviour as CEO, that he thought it was okay to have risque parties to entertain high-value customers. And I wonder how many other people in the organisation were on that boat. How deep-seated is the problem in the organisation, and the cultural issues that the end justifies the means. So we've got Gary as the protagonist, the embittered, disgruntled employee, and we know from the past that a disgruntled employee can talk to journalists, can seek retribution against the company, can take the company through litigation. So I would be asking Frank, what's really going on inside your organisation? Is it just Gary that's been doing the wrong thing? Because the reason given for his dismissal of poor performance seems to be only one part of the problem. So I would want to dig and delve a little more to find out the real story, because Gary may go out and tell the real story, and if I'm not properly informed, I cannot give Frank the very best advice. The other issue that I see is that Gary was suffering from depression, and he claims the board knew that. So I think we've got another health issue to deal with here. Is this company a very uncaring organisation? How does it treat its employees with health issues? Depression is a huge issue in Australia. The media write about it frequently. So I think we've got quite a complex story evolving here, and I, as the Public Relations Advisor, need Frank to be very candid with me about all the facts so that I can then give him frank and fearless advice.
Well, let's unpack that, and Frank being Frank, capitalised and otherwise, says to you, Robyn, the truth be told, I was getting an enormous amount of pressure from the private equity guys that the numbers were not stacking up, and I needed to make a decision, if for no other reason, but just to be doing something differently. The depression, well, yes, I'm not an unsympathetic fellow, but this is really the first that I've heard of it. Other board members have had friendships with Gary. I don't know what they knew, but wasn't that high on my list in terms of decision-making factors. Does that help you?
Well, I would say there are two clear reasons for the dismissal. One is poor performance, but why weren't you counselling your CEO? Surely the board was hauling him over the coals. You have board meetings once a quarter. How often do you have board meetings? Why was he so shocked that you've suddenly sacked him if it's come out of the blue? He's had no warnings, no alerts. Again, Frank, it seems strange that the CEO didn't know the board was unhappy with his performance. So I'm still not convinced that we've got a strong case if he indeed goes public.
With respect, Robyn, as the CEO, you are ultimately accountable, and by virtue of not having complete clarity over the results of the company, confirms that the person is wrong in the role. So, you know, I think there is a, how much does the chairman tell you, or how much has the rest of the board told you? That's where, as the CEO, your feedback comes from. But if the results aren't there, whether it's the private equity guys pushing or whoever the ownership guys are pushing, that is your role, and that is ultimately what a CEO is there to deliver. And there is no one but them that needs to come up with the goods, and or here is the plan for coming up with the goods. And one of the interesting things with the CEO is he has not been dismissed early in the piece. So this is not, I've got a plan laid out and I've been cut short to getting the results. He's been there for quite some time, and it's come to that point. So it's kind of interesting that at a CEO level, you shouldn't need to be told that your performance is not right, because it's there, it's in the board pack, it's in the numbers, it's in everything in front of you.
Well, that's very interesting. So I'm hearing, as Frank, some conflicting messaging around what I should have done as his boss, as chairman of the board. I need a legal opinion on this. I've got some lawyers who are giving me some funny advice about restraints. I'm not altogether happy. I hear there's this great barrister, Tim Donaghey, who gives frank, or a different word, candid, honest, to the point advice. Straight out question for you, Tim. Did I need to go through a process with Gary in the same way that I might for a receptionist or a clerk or a junior sales employee?
Two answers to that, Joydeep. The first one is, what does his contract say? Because his contract for most employees in Australia is the first port of call. Now, in the package, in the video, it was clear that Gary hadn't signed his contract, and there are situations in which courts will find that the written terms of a contract bind an employee, despite the fact that the pen never hit the page. And we're not given enough of the facts to know whether this is one such case, but that would be the first place to look, the first starting inquiry. But I'm intrigued to hear from the other panellists that culture matters to the organisation, but to the lawyer coming from the outside to advise, culture is fine. Culture is something that gets put to the rear of your inquiry. The real question is, was this person terminated in accordance with their contract or otherwise in breach of statute? Because it might sound harsh and it might sound unusual, but this employee was sacked for partly performance reasons and partly for conduct reasons. And neither of those, unless his contract expressly says otherwise, stops him being terminated or makes it harsh or makes it otherwise contrary to law.
So Frank hears that and he says to you, Tim, should I be worried?
Short answer, yes, because Gary was angry, and angry people tend to want to fight for their rights. We're in an era where I think less disapproval or less disopprobrium attaches to people suing to enforce their rights, and we're also in an era where employment is far more codified and regulated in a federal sense than it's ever been before. Today's contracts can sound in damages, that is to say, there's been a breach, the court will order damages to compensate the individual, to put them back in the position that they were in before the contract was breached. But there are also a series of other types of orders that can be made by courts, particularly federal courts, and they include injunctions, penalties, make-up pay, interest payments, and other things to compensate a person for what has been a breach of statute or contract, or in some cases a breach of both.
So when my lawyers told me that Gary doesn't have access to the unfair dismissal jurisdiction or remedy because he's earning $350,000, $400,000, what you're really telling me is that that's not the be-all and end-all.
No. There are 4 different types of termination cases that can be run based upon the Fair Work Act alone, and that doesn't include discrimination and other statutes. So let's face it, Gary has a whole suite of remedies if he chooses to pursue them. The real question is, given that he was sacked for a reason which appears does not relate to his mental condition and does not relate to any other physical disability, is not because he's pregnant or affiliated with a political party, are there any other prohibited grounds or prohibited reasons that he might sue for? First blush is, I think he has a claim based upon the length of notice, but I think that any other type of claim that he might bring could potentially be a stretch.
Okay. Well, he is angry. Absolutely he's angry.
Yep.
He has been, in his view, very generous with his time towards you, Hanna Low, over the years, taken calls at odd times and always spoken frankly. He's become a good friend. He tells you his story. What interests you in that story, if anything?
Well, I think there's a number of things. To begin with, it sort of meets the threshold test that it's a obviously large company or a large-ish company. It's a company that already has a public profile, and it's a company that has attracted media attention in the past. In terms of his particular circumstances, I think there are allegations being thrown around that include bullying, that include the highest levels of the company, and that include the culture of the company. And then, of course, you throw into the mix the risque party, which has already attracted media attention. So realistically, that in itself would be enough to warrant some sort of media interest in the story. You've then got an issue about whether or not he has what I would call being performance managed out of the company. And that's something that the media, particularly business media, are also very interested in, given the prevalence that's been very common, I suppose, in the last 5 years, particularly in professional services firms. So that's also another, I suppose, red flag. And then on top of that, you've got his allegation or his suggestion that he was stressed and depressed. So once you sort of throw it all into the mix, it's quite an interesting story.
Okay. Let's talk about the boat incident. Now, when you hear that as a journalist, surely there must be a part of you that thinks, well, Gary, you're talking about that, but you were the CEO. What were you doing on that boat? Or is this more interesting for the overall tapestry of what makes for a good story?
No, I think it's both. I mean, I think we heard in the video that that issue's already been agitated in the media. So no doubt there would have been some commentary around whether or not that was an appropriate thing for the CEO to do. But in terms of painting a picture for readers about what was going on in the company, what goes on behind the scenes, and what's obviously being sanctioned at the highest level, then that gives a great sort of amount of colour to the culture of the organisation. So I think, yes, there would be some critical thought around whether or not it was an appropriate thing for the CEO to do, but I suspect, I don't know for sure, but I suspect that's something that's already old news. So now it will become an issue around how the company, how they choose to deal with that, and things like what other executives were on the boat, whether or not they also received a rap over the knuckles or were dismissed, any of those sorts of things.
Robyn Sefiani, you are fully aware of the high calibre of the intrepid journalist Hanna Low. You know that she knows how to sniff out a good story. You also know that Frank and the company and the board are particularly nervous about this boat incident. Frank says to you, Robyn, while I would prefer that it didn't come out, I actually feel better that Gary has gone because, to the point about culture, no one can accuse me of standing up for tolerating an inappropriate culture. Is that going to wash from an external comms point of view?
I would probably be advising Frank that we need to prepare a media statement because I would anticipate that Hanna will be calling. We'll probably want to interview someone from the company. We'll have some very particular and incisive and potentially damaging questions for the company. So my role is to ask questions of Frank so that we can put together a statement on behalf of the company that says these very inappropriate forms of entertainment for customers were not known to the board. It was something that was being held purely under the auspices of the CEO, who is no longer with the company. We're very concerned that this has taken place. We've done a full investigation of the organisation. We know that no other incidents have occurred apart from those that were being supervised by the CEO, the departed CEO, and we have taken measures to ensure they will never happen again. So I think that the organisation has to give assurance that the board didn't know about it. The board absolutely is horrified by what it's found, and that an investigation has taken place, and it is not something that's happening anywhere else in the organisation, and we can assure you it will never happen again. And then we need some sort of very reassuring comment about the nature of our business, the nature of our company, that we have strict protocols, strict standards, but to ensure that this never happens again, we will be reiterating this with all of our employees, particularly our sales staff. We'll be making it very clear what our entertainment policies are. So we've got to look squeaky clean, but we do have to express regret at what has taken place, but that is something in the past, and we have taken the necessary measures to ensure it won't be repeated.
Michele Grow, newly appointed board member, are you reassured by Robyn's sound counsel? Are you nervous about Hanna Low's interest in this particular dismissal?
I'm nervous about both. One, I don't know how long ago the boat incident was. If it was more than a week or so, I think it's too little too late. If the board had such significant concern, if it hasn't acted for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months, I think it leaves open a gap that I'm sure someone of Hanna's talent would grasp very, very, very quickly. I think there is some secondary, how is it possible for the CEO to have very public entertainment that's reported in the media that the board has no knowledge of, and where is the fiscal accountability for the CEO's expenditure? So I think it opens up and leaves me with more questions unanswered than it has answered, and I think any good journalist would be picking up on those and taking them further.
John Dakin, your company has had a long-standing contractual arrangement with the company, and even though this slipped under the radar from Frank's point of view, Jeannie, the head of people and brand for the organisation, let you know that Gary was about to be let go, and so you've had the opportunity to spend a little bit of time with him, and he tells you his narrative, his story. What are you going to be telling him in terms of what his next step should be?
First issue, I think, is to ensure that Gary his health and well-being is looked after, so to continue with professional advice, and that he protect his personal brand, and therefore to react at all in anger, and I think it's quite obvious that he would be angry after this, but to react in anger could actually do him a lot of damage. So we'd be looking to him to actually seek advice about communications, to look at his brand, to look at really the focus on the future. What's happened has happened, and it's a very complex issue. For him to be stuck in the past is not going to work for him and could simply put him into a spiral downwards. So we'd really try and focus on where next and how best to get there.
Okay. He talks with some vitriol about not being any more worried about his reputation than the board members should be worried about theirs. A helpful headspace? Do we need to at least let that play out, or what do we do?
I don't think you can let that just play out, Joydeep. I think he needs to seek advice about his reputation, about how best to guide that reputation. To go forward, he's going to need to have good referee support, and to be pulling the board and the company down with him is going to really work against that. And Sydney's a very tiny town, and he needs to look at really being professional through all of this, despite his anger.
John, you say that the reputational part is a concern. Does that mean you're going to advise him to seek legal advice, or you're not going to intrude into that arena?
I'd certainly advise him to seek legal advice.
I'm curious because it occurs to me that few CEOs, Joydeep, have sued in this town, and it doesn't seem to have affected all of their employment prospects, or at least not the couple that I can think of offhand.
It's funny, Tim, that you mention John saying to Gary, or not saying to Gary, whether he should get legal advice. John's mulling over this particular issue, but the two of you are close. And you're someone that John feels he can reach out to on a no-names basis. But he has had the opportunity to spend some time with Gary, and he asks you, Tim, does Gary have a case?
Gary certainly has a case if he can identify an iteration or an item in his contract that has not been adhered to. And that gets me circling back to what I said before about whether the contract's been signed. Gary was fairly firm that it hadn't been signed, but it may be that he's done something or a series of somethings which indicate his acceptance of the terms of that contract beyond merely being paid for his services. One example might be that there's a requirement for him to be assessed in a particular way or to perform something that's not a run-of-the-mill duty for a CEO. It's written down in the contract, he hasn't signed the contract, but the employer can say, aha, look, you've abided by this term, we will argue before a court that you have accepted the written terms of employment by your conduct and by what you do. So investigating that gives the clearest answer. But even assuming that he hasn't signed the contract and something like that doesn't exist, my view is that he has a notice claim to some degree. He's the chief executive, or the former chief executive, I should say, of a sizable company. 3 months' notice, which he's been given and presumably paid in lieu rather than given the chance to serve it out, is almost certainly less than half, but probably even less than a third of what he might get if he's sued in a court of competent jurisdiction.
Gary uses the word bullying when he talks about what's happened to him. Everyone in this room is well aware of the significant changes that are happening to bullying laws. And Hanna, this makes for surely a wonderful case study with less than 6 weeks to go to the most significant reforms to human rights legislation in this country. The introduction of a standalone bullying regime with potentially limitless orders being able to be made by the Fair Work Commission. What better way to put this on your readership's radar than to talk about that particular nuance of executive and corporate bullying?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think that there are probably a number of stories in what we've heard so far.
Tides you over for the quiet time.
Exactly, good Christmas stories. I think one of them is, in fact, as you've suggested, a story which essentially is a story talking about the legal issues, but using this case as an example to really, I suppose, bring home to readers what this actually means. So you would say, for example, in this particular case involving Gary, the orders that could be made are limitless, and then I might quote someone like you, which would talk about how broad these orders or the claims or the court issues could be. I think there's also another story. I think there's probably a story about the dispute itself, assuming that it does make it to court. And I think there's also probably a bigger piece about the company and what's really been going on behind the scenes, as I sort of mentioned before, using the yacht example as a nice anecdote, perhaps to open that.
Hanna, what's of more interest to your readers, the fate of the ousted CEO or the Love Boat?
Look, I think that depends which publication I'm writing for these days. But I also think it depends which section of the paper you're talking about. So if you're looking at the legal issues and what the fate of the CEO might be in terms of what the court might order, that's probably a good legal affairs story. If you're looking at, painting sort of a sorted picture of this yacht and the escorts and what's, some of the dirt that's been going on amongst the CEO and potentially other executives, that's probably a weekend feature. And then if you're looking at when the news breaks, I would say that's just a straight page one news story. So you've got kind of the whole gamut, yeah.
John, you're concerned in your discussions that you're having with Gary about the mental health piece. He shares with you that he has been seeing a psychologist for some time. He is taking antidepressants. Your other good friend, Michele Grow, is someone who you've reached out to over the years in relation to these broad mental health type challenges that you see with candidates and individuals. What might be some of the questions that you have for Michele?
Well, it would be around depression, how serious that depression is, and how he and his family could be affected by that. And in a time of anger, a time of confusion, is he actually continuing with his professional support, and is that support giving him what he needs?
Michele, John tells you this story. You have no idea that he's talking about the former CEO of the company that you've just joined as a director. Putting your other hat on, what can you share with us about the impact from a mental health point of view of this kind of alleged treatment, hearing only perhaps Gary's side of the story?
Yeah, look, I think Gary's side of the story, he indicated that he had been seeing a psychologist. He didn't really disclose much more than that, and I think it would be important to understand, has he actually been diagnosed with a mental illness, or is he just feeling stressed and feeling anxious. Is he taking some form of medication, prescribed, or at this point I expect he's also probably self-medicating pretty heavily. So, you know, what are all of the parameters that are sitting around his behaviour? And as John said, making sure that he is continuing to seek appropriate support for whatever level of condition he has. If he's not, helping to facilitate him into that form of support and treatment.
Okay. The company, we heard, has introduced a number of policies and procedures dealing with performance management. We heard the reference from Frank that, come on, reality check. This is our CEO, he's paid the big bucks. Surely you don't expect me to go through this, I think the reference was to a Mickey Mouse performance improvement plan for someone who's our CEO. Tim, from a legal point of view, policies of that nature, do they help or hinder an organisation?
They can do both. They can bind the organisation, and then they are required as a term of the contract. They can be a kind of guideline that binds or directs an employee and doesn't bind the organisation. The possibilities are limited only to the way it's drafted, and you know, as you've known from your practice and as I know from mine, the skill of the drafter is paramount. So the question can be, in an evidentiary sense, whether a policy really had any bearing on the CEO at all. Plenty of policies apply to all employees, and of course CEO is merely a species of employee, albeit at the apex of the pyramid. The real question is, what does a policy require and who does it bind? In that sense, it's not materially different to the contract question we've been kicking around, but it needs to be construed in accordance with its terms. And I've been involved in cases where the employer was shocked and more than a little dismayed to find that something it intended to apply to a certain class of employee could actually be interpreted to apply to others it didn't intend to bind.
Robyn, you've heard that legal advice in relation to policies. Anything bother you from a non-legal point of view around a potential message that is disseminated by Gary, that there were these policies that I had to implement when I was managing people, but when it came to me being an alleged underperformer, they were thrown out the window? Is that of concern?
Well, there does seem to be a lot of inconsistency, and I think the concern is that has the board followed due process? So it'd be very easy to start pointing the finger at others in the organisation. And while all this discussion's happening, I'm just thinking, if the story of depression gets out, Jeff Kennett from Beyond Blue is probably going to weigh into this discussion.
We don't need that. We don't need that.
So, you know, it's so fraught with danger because of the fact that the contract wasn't signed, there weren't clear guidelines supposedly from the board, but from Gary's own interview, he seemed like a bit of a maverick CEO who thought he could do anything. So it's, there's no clear-cut direction here, and I think that in a response you have to do a lot of contingency planning. And as a communications advisor, I'd be looking at all those potential risk scenarios, whichever way the story might pan out, and work with Frank to have responses to protect the company. Because I am wondering how the media might deal with the point about depression, because someone who's suffering from depression could be considered not to be responsible for their actions, which might have led to the risque parties and so on. So there just seems to be, from a communications standpoint, I'm concerned about the strength of the chair's position.
Okay. Michele, any thoughts? Are you as concerned about the strength of the chair's position?
I'd almost want to take the depression piece and throw it out of the argument altogether. And that's probably fairly strong words from someone who runs an organisation that's focused on mental health, where it is a very serious and significant issue, but I think it is a complete red herring from Gary's perspective in this issue, because people who have mental health come to work, they perform, they are performance managed, they engage in social activities. It is not an impediment to them, it is a condition, as many other conditions are, and I think in this case it's there as a red herring. So there is nothing in the way this has come about that has any connection or linkage to Gary's mental health condition, whatever that condition may be. And I think there's a real risk here from Gary's perspective and from others into turning that into, you know, something much more than it really is and taking away from the core issues. That doesn't help Gary. It doesn't help the organisation. So I think, you know, there's a whole piece in there for me around the mental health which just does not sit well.
But Hanna, when Gary says to you that it was almost as though the knowledge of me seeing a psych and being diagnosed with depression was what tipped the board over the edge, this very strong argument that they did this to me in the full knowledge of my mental health condition, presumably very fertile territory for making Gary the new poster boy of mental health issues in Australian workplaces.
I think to some extent, yes. I think I'd have to pin Gary down on the timing of that and make sure that it wasn't, I suppose, just a convenient excuse. And I think also I don't think it's the case in this particular circumstance, but if there was any suggestion that his mental health issue had arisen as a result of his role or as a result of what had been happening in the company, I think that's actually when it becomes a lot more interesting from a media point of view. I do think that there would be a concern, and I would want to hear what the company had to say in relation to how they supported him through that and how they dealt with that. But I think there are a few unanswered questions in terms of timing.
I think, Joydeep, there's also I think there's some factual information about mental health. So 45% of adult Australians will experience a mental health issue in their lifetime. So if that's not you, it's the person right next to you. So I think, you know, we need to personalise it and think about this is not an isolated incident where someone's been targeted. Mental health is quite a significant issue in Australia, and it will be Gary and many, many others, some who have disclosed, some who have not disclosed. So it is a very, very common issue in the working population of Australia.
Well, in fact, on those statistics of the 400-odd employees in this organisation, you're dealing with something like 190-odd who would have mental health issues.
At some time in their lifetime, yes.
Sure. And a statistic that Frank responds to and says, well, surely it's not my problem to be on top of the status of everyone's mental health who works for me. Or is it?
From a legal perspective, that question that Hanna was talking about and the subsequent comments really give him a powerful legal argument. If there's a causative relationship between a diagnosed or even an undiagnosed mental condition and the termination of employment, that gives Gary a powerful tool under the Fair Work Act to seek redress for his termination. It's completely apart from fairness. It's more akin to a discrimination ground, but it is a general protections claim under Part 3.1 of the Fair Work Act, and it is something that has no limits, unlike unfair dismissal, and can be broad-reaching in terms of those types of relief that I referred to before. I'm intrigued to see it there, but as it wasn't developed, I can't really say more than that. And unlike Michelle, I'm not criticising your drafting.
and Joydeep, to your point about, is it Frank's responsibility to be across every employee? No, it's not, but as the chairman of the board and the chairman of the company, it is his role to make sure that there are appropriate care and protection in place for the workforce of the organisation, which would include things like appropriate mental health awareness, appropriate mental health training, along with all of the other appropriate care for the workforce. So to at an individual level, no, but are we providing the right level of care and support for our workforce? Yes.
And Tim, can I just go back? When you were just talking about the potential claim that could arise if there was a causative relationship,
Yep.
Is that the sort of claim where you'd have the reverse onus, like an adverse action sort of?
Well, I think it's frequently called a reverse onus, but it really is more akin in legal terms to an evidentiary burden to be discharged. So basically, if the evidence is finally balanced, then the court will presume that there is a causative relationship and that the person has been terminated for the prohibited reason. But in this case, the facts of this case are that there are at least a couple of other reasons that could be advanced by the employer for the termination. And if I understand the way that Frank put it, it appears more likely to be either the financial performance of the company, the Love Boat and the fallout from the Love Boat in terms of the media attention to it, as well as the feeling that this guy's just not the right fit for the job. Now, none of those three things are overwhelming the way they're presented to us, but they each has the potential to be a non-prohibited and therefore non-actionable reason for the termination of this fellow.
Yeah, that's right. But if Gary were to choose to bring an adverse action claim, which encompassed the depression issue, but also a whole heap of other issues, and just had some nice detail around the pleadings to just, you know, kick it along a little bit for the media.
Sure.
Then a lot of what we're seeing, or some of the cases that I'm seeing that are brought in the courts these days, personally identify and name either CEOs or senior managers as defendants that also face personal orders against them and personal penalties, which is, it's obviously that heightens the media interest, but it's also, I suppose, more problematic from a company point of view.
I think it was you, Michelle, who mentioned early on that there are obligations for boards under the Corporations Act, and those have existed since there were companies codes and the very early corporations law of Australia. But in particular, the current industrial legislation does not have any borders beyond which the disgruntled employee cannot reach, that they can reach into any level of management, including the board of the company, and allege misconduct of a kind that is causative of termination. I won't say any more than that, but the bottom line here is that Frank himself could end up being on the receiving end of a suit and would face not significant, but certainly unpleasant penalties against him personally.
And potentially the rest of the board if there were discussions, as we saw in the video, that there may have been discussions between Frank and others.
Just discussions alone won't do it, but the question has to be who took the prohibited action, who took the discriminatory action, or who took the action that is causative of the termination. So far we've got Frank, and on Joydeep's summary afterwards we've got Frank saying, hey, I didn't know about the mental illness. If that stands up to rigorous analysis, including some kind of very terse and grumpy cross-examination from someone who looks like me, then maybe he'll be fine.
Robyn, the talk about, excuse me, personal lawsuits, it's one thing to talk about Gary bringing a claim against the company as his former employer, but this is taking things surely into a far more alarming realm when it comes to Frank and perhaps his other board directors. Perhaps Michelle has escaped the scrutiny of that given the timing, but any changes to your advice or your perspective, recognising that we could be dealing with a far broader set of legal problems than just a company versus dismissed employee?
Well, I'd be advising Frank not to speak directly to Hanna, because I think...
But she's so nice.
Yes, I know.
So sorry, Hanna.
But she's a very astute journalist and she's going to ask a lot of very probing questions. If he's facing potential litigation, he's got to be very careful what he says. So we could issue brief statements that are going to help protect him or protect his reputation. They would have to be passed by Tim, if Tim's the lawyer. So here the communications advisor has to work closely with the legal advisor. And
it's good how you guys all look after each other as well. I think that's really
yes, but we don't always agree, because sometimes as a communication advisor, I'd be saying to my client, it's really important that we say something, and the lawyer might be saying, don't say anything. So that's where the client ultimately has to make the decision, and it can be quite difficult because they're weighing up protecting their reputation, looking to be doing the right thing, and not getting into legal hot water. So it is where communications and law has to work very closely together. And we mostly manage to come to an agreement. But I think in this situation, if there is possible legal action against the chairman, we'd be cautious about what we go out with publicly. What I want to know as the communications person is when he became aware of everything. I mean, as Hanna said, timing and sequence of events is really important in these circumstances. And so there has to be quite a bit of investigation of what happened when. and then taking that into account, if it is going to head down a legal path, be cautious but try and give some sort of statement that is going to be beneficial to the reputation of this fellow.
Frank takes your advice on board as he always does, but as with so many people in his position, has formed a different view in relation to the appropriate strategy. Frank's idea is that he actually wants to turn this into a positive for the company. He wants to get a message out there that the company now takes poor performance extremely seriously. The company is being responsive to the inadequate numbers. And this is a perfect opportunity. Hanna has always been a receptive ear for Frank as much as she has been to Gary. He wants to pick up the phone and he wants to talk to Hanna about that as a positive for the company. Would you talk him out of it vigorously, or would you
Absolutely.
see the benefits of it?
No, I'm going to talk him out of it because he's going to look like a very unfeeling, aggressive chairman. Sure, it's a chairman's role to ensure that the company is performing well, but there are so many grey areas here. It's not just cut and dried. And I think, given that Gary might be also talking to Hanna, I've got to assume that he probably is. So Hanna is going to come with all sorts of loaded questions. Frank would be a lamb to the slaughter to talk to Hanna. So I'm going to give him very strong advice not to do so.
Hanna, is that a fair assessment of what Frank would face?
I think to be fair, yeah, he would, assuming that I had spoken with Gary, I would obviously be wanting to, I suppose, put to him a lot of the assertions that Gary had suggested to me. One of the, which could potentially open Frank up, like that could be something that could leave him in an uncomfortable position, but the alternative scenario is that it could disavow me of things that I thought were fact, but having heard the other side of the story and perhaps being able to look at some evidence or some sort of documentary evidence that might suggest that in fact Gary's lying. Also, there's the issue whenever you're trying to determine what the story is, that if someone is prepared to speak with you and another person is not prepared to make themselves available, it's very difficult to work out what that side and what that point of view is. And a statement is yes, is better than nothing, but I would still say that it's very inadequate. What a lot of, and obviously it depends on the sensitivity of the situation, the player involved and also the journalist involved, but what a lot of directors and a lot of senior managers and CEOs do if they have a rapport with the journalist is they'll background them, and there might be some things that are completely no-go zones, or there might be some things that are allowed to be discussed on background but not to be reproduced in the story, or there might be some things that are not for attribution but can appear in the story. So there's sort of a number of ways to go, but depending on the situation and the journalist, and to the extent that they'd made up their mind, if they'd accepted Gary's story as fact, then I think that potentially it could be quite dangerous.
And I think there are two possible scenarios here. Depending, if Hanna has approached the company seeking an interview, then we need to deal with that situation. The other scenario is the company gets me as their communications advisor to proactively contact Hanna to seek the interview. Now, if it's Hanna approaching the company, we have to consider how we're going to respond. And my advice would be that I speak to Hanna and I ask her, what are the questions that you'd like to put to Frank? Because that's going to give me an idea of how much Hanna knows. It'll give me an idea of whether Gary might have briefed her. Now, a journalist will never disclose their sources, but if Hanna puts to me certain allegations, I can assume Gary has spoken to her. So I then need to talk to Frank to say, okay, this is what Hanna knows. We have to figure out how we're going to respond. Do we absolutely refute some of these allegations because they are completely wrong? Do we go back and give some answers? And at that point, once we know what Hanna knows, we can then make an informed decision about whether Frank should engage directly with Hanna, whether we should do it by written responses to the questions or simply a brief written statement.
Written responses? You guys are preparing to try the case. You guys can get your heads together and appoint Judge Judy and have it done within a fortnight. You don't need me.
John, we hear a story when we talk to Gary about a man who has, from his point of view, invested his whole life in this particular organisation. He talks in his own words about it was different back then in the 80s when I started. People used to have fun. When someone has been at an organisation pretty much for the entirety of their working lives, what are some of the particular challenges that that person faces? What is Gary going to face into as he tests the job market?
Well, look, he's grown up with an organisation for decades, from when it was very small to being quite large, and really meteoric success within that organisation, getting to the top job. He could well be living back in the past. He may well not have had the training he should have had to become CEO, and perhaps the board should have looked at that before appointing him. But to be with an organisation for 20 plus years, to some extent you're institutionalised and need to be really looking at what is the outside world like, because it's not going to be the same there. So we would be doing assessments with him around the things that motivate him, the sorts of organisations that will work, the style of individual that he should be reporting to, and quite possibly Frank isn't that individual. Just to get a sense that he does have a future elsewhere, that he's got skills, obviously, he's got strong capabilities and some huge successes, but he's got to build on those elsewhere. And he may not be able to see himself outside the organisation for quite a while.
Okay. Rough estimate of how long I might be out of work, ask Gary?
Could well be over 12 months. After GFC, could be 2 years. Yeah.
12 months, 2 years. Tim, relevance for the legal case?
Yes, well, Joydeep is actually baiting me here because he knows, as do I, that the major case on reasonable notice are cases that have ordered 12 months reasonable notice, that is, damages for breach of an employment contract of 12 months. There's also a first instance decision in Tasmania that was appealed on other grounds that went for 2 years, but the high watermark in this country for payment to an employee for this kind of suit is 12 months. So Frank, in all his wisdom, paying 3 months, is not ungenerous, but he's out of step with the legal authority.
Okay. The cultural journey. Many organisations represented here today have, whether in recent years or going back a number of years, made that very significant decision to introduce cultural change in their organisations. I'm interested, and I'll open it to any of you. Can an organisation do that? Is it bound to result in fallout? What are some of the tips and suggestions that you can give to organisations when they are looking at introducing cultural change? Starting with Robyn.
Well, I think organisation transformation is happening everywhere, and it's happening for different reasons, whether it's financial pressures, downsizing, and certainly cultural change is at the heart of any organisation that's going through that sort of change or a merger or an acquisition. Employee morale, motivation and productivity is very much linked to culture. And there are lots of experts out there that are available to advise leadership teams on how to inculcate a good culture in an organisation. From my perspective, I think it's got a lot to do with clear communication and consistent communication. I've worked with a lot of organisations where there is a poor culture, and it very often boils down to, you know, we don't hear anything, we're in the dark, there's inconsistent messaging. So, and I'm not just banging my own drum as a communicator, but I do think that good, clear, consistent communication is key to good culture.
Michele, your thoughts on that? You've worn a couple of hats when it comes to cultural change.
I have. I think culture can be changed, generally not quickly, but I think it needs a couple of things to occur. Firstly, the organisation needs to be clear about what they want to change the culture to and why. Because often there's this lovely set of words that organisations come up with and say, well, this is part of our culture, but it's then not demonstrated, so it loses credibility and loses momentum. So I think first is, well, what is the culture you're trying to create, and why is that important or relevant or critical for this industry, this business, and how much of our business currently aligns to that? So do our business practices align to that? Is it likely that the professionals we need working in our business align to that? Will that culture attract the right number of people? So I think there's a piece in there, because depending on where you sit, it's very difficult to change the culture of an organisation without having some degree of turnover. Now that may be turnover by natural attrition, it may be some turnover alternatively because people choose that this is no longer in alignment with where I want to sit. And I'd kind of put culture and values together, because people align their personal values with the culture of the organisation. So yes, I think it can be done. I agree with Robyn that it generally needs some external guidance and support. It's very difficult from within to see clearly what's happening within, and to be prepared to work on it, invest on it over a longer term.
John, the importance of taking employees with you on that culture change journey.
You certainly can't impose cultural change. You have to inspire people to, you've got to get them to own it well and truly. So to start from the ground, well, start at the top obviously, but then build it from the ground up as well is terribly important. And words on pages and on screens don't matter a scrap. It's actually seeing the cultural change, seeing the way that people behave is really what matters. And what's being rewarded as well.
Sure. Hanna, can it ever make for a good news story, an organisation wanting to introduce cultural change of such significance?
I don't think it will be, a story wouldn't be introducing cultural change. I think if there had been a marked change over a short period of time, and I think the story would most likely centre around the head, the CEO or the board or very senior management, and how they had inspired the rest of the organisation. I think what unfortunately is more common is identifying the need to change the culture and embarking upon that, but then sort of falling off the track as that goes through, and potentially there might be some particular circumstances which are newsworthy, which show that the cultural change either hasn't filtered down sufficiently or hasn't been adopted by those at the top.
Tim, the legal consequences of getting this wrong?
The legal consequences can be seen with the takeover from the private equity in the example we gave. It seems to me that I come from the opposite end to Robyn and Michele. They're talking about getting into an organisation. I'm the contractor who's wheeled in after the problems have emerged, and usually after they've reached litigation, though not always then. So I think I see it on the micro level. It is the personality conflict that is most immediately apparent to me, and that kind of takeover or that kind of divestment of the business has a very long history in causing terminations of employment, and the line between them is rather hard and bold rather than dotted and vague.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our panellists. I always feel like Tony Jones at this point in time. Hopefully what you have heard today has enforced or reinforced to you the critical importance of what we as a firm have been preaching since our inception, and that is the need for a holistic approach to dealing with people management matters. Getting the law right is only one very small part of properly managing your risk. What you've heard today is the critical importance of understanding the potential reputational impact. You've heard the importance of what could be the fallout from a morale point of view. You've heard about what might be some of the consequences in terms of a broader cultural criticism that your organisation does not take mental health issues seriously. And many of you here espouse that you will do exactly that. And I'd suggest, without wanting to put words in Hanna Low's mouth, that one of the most fertile grounds for a journalist to explore would be organisational hypocrisy. and that remains one of the most significant concerns for employers in Australia. From 1 January of next year, there will be the most unprecedented laws relating to human rights, as I said earlier, that not only Australia has ever seen, but the world has ever seen. The bullying legislation that will be in effect from 1 January 2014 is bound to open the floodgates. It is axiomatic that that will be a consequence. And the reason why it's axiomatic that that will be a consequence is because the definition of bullying that's contained in the legislation is so massively subjective. But that is only one of the reasons. Even in spite of there being no bullying laws, leave aside work health and safety regulation of bullying at present, as many of you would know, I've said for many years now that the incidence of bullying complaints in organisations in this country is of pandemic proportions. And it is largely because people feel the necessity to put labels on conduct. Have we as organisations created a binary situation where an employee either does nothing about something or they have to put a provocative, serious and quite traumatic label on what they consider has happened to them? Whether it's the new bullying laws, whether it's the kind of matters that we have discussed today, I think hopefully one of your key takeouts from today's session is that regardless of what termination of employment situation you're dealing with, every termination of employment has got to be treated as the most difficult dismissal of all. Thank you very much.
What a shame that was only a hypothetical, because I was sitting here thinking I was quite looking forward to Hannah's weekend feature, actually, but we won't get to see it, unfortunately. And I couldn't decide whether I want to be on Frank or Gary's side, but I thought probably I'd go with the side that Tim picked. I thought I'd be pretty happy with that. So, look, I think, Joydeep summed that up very well. It's overwhelming to me just to see how those issues are so linked. You get the ethical issues, the social issues, the legal issues, and they're all piled into a point you cannot unpick them as isolated issues again. So, just the blurring of all those lines is fascinating. This night is, of course, also about getting to know the panellists, getting to know Joydeep and the members of the PCS team. So, just on behalf of PCS, I'd like to invite you all to stay, enjoy some drinks and canapes, and discuss that very prickly topic of tonight with each other. So, thank you very much, everyone, for attending tonight, and enjoy your evening.